Welcome back. In our last segment, we showed you how the development process for pharmaceutical drugs, especially for those drugs that never make it to market, contribute to the high cost of drugs that we do buy. For more, I sat down with Journal News reporter behind their expose out this weekend, David Robinson. First of all, a great piece, and I appreciate the time. For me, David, I thought I knew a lot about this, but I didn't realize how much the Hudson Valley has invested in this issue with two principal anchor big pharmas that we'll talk about in a moment. But also, this is a national debate that's going on, and we're right at the crux of trying to figure out what to do about it, if anything. And in many ways, focusing on these two companies and principals in the Valley, it put a human face on it. So talk about, for people who don't know, how in Westchester and Rockland, there's some real players involved.
Yes, very much so. They are a representative of the entire national debate about this. I mean, when you're talking about a Regeneron in Westchester County and a Pfizer and its presence in Pearl River and Rockland County, there's deep roots there. I mean, there's years of research and development that have been taking place at both of those facilities. Pfizer's complex goes back 100 years, has deep roots in vaccine breakthroughs for smallpox, polio, bifurcated needle, and you go to Regeneron on the other side of the river, and they're a little bit more kind of a newer player on the block, I guess, so you can call them, and their story kind of tells a unique example of kind of 20 years toiling away in research and development, millions of dollars invested in it, and then what it means to bring a drug to market after the fact, and to delve into the debate over pricing, over insurance, over patients' access to the drugs that are, in a lot of cases, life-saving and life-changing.
And before we get into the whys and the what to do about it and the various players, let's try and put a human face in it. And you did this with David Mitchell, because I think for many people out there at home, that whole debate about I have to sometimes decide between food or medicine, he's emblematic of it. He's not somebody that, doesn't A, have coverage, also B, this is somebody that has put a lot of thought to it, but the economics of it, I think, are really telling as to where we are right now.
Yeah, I think his quote in the story really hit it on the head. I mean, he's talking about getting 22 infusions for an incurable blood cancer a year at a cost of $440,000, saying $440,000 worth of drugs are literally keeping him alive. His $440,000 price tag for his cancer drugs is something that is putting a burden on Medicare in his case. He's eligible for Medicare now. And that's putting a burden on Medicare to a degree that it was unthinkable, several decades ago.
In fact, you put the math of it in your piece that by 2025, it's projected that 1 out of every $5 spent in the United States will be spent on health care. That's an unaffordable model.
That's the unsustainable path that they're talking about here.
So the question that everyone always asks is why? Why are the prices so exorbitant for some drugs versus others? Why is it that for a little pill it's going to cost X? What did you find out? Because it was illuminating conversations. There isn't even denials from some of Big Pharma that some of the pricing here is exorbitant. There's some reasons why, but also it seems to be a little bit of a Wild West as to who shall decide how much and for what.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, there's market forces that control pricing, and in other elements, there's regulation at the government on the government side. But the executives will be the first to tell you that defining the rewards of what goes into the research and development that it costs to bring these drugs to market. When you're talking about 20 years of research to bring a drug that saves somebody's life for cancer, when you're talking about the gene therapy breakthroughs that you're reading today in the newspapers about, these are drugs that were science fiction, 5-10 years ago.
Okay, so hypothetically, I'm a startup drug company. Assuming I have the cash reserves to be spending years upon years to try and develop here something that I can bring to market without guarantees, I'm obviously absorbing a lot of costs. But at the point that I get a drug and it gets a patent and it goes to market, how many years do I have, or I have an exclusivity, if you will, with that patent before it then goes to the generic drug phase?
Yeah, there's a patent cycle, and typically it's several years, and that's where the pricing discussion of Regeneron's executives come into it. Their discussion really, and as the CEO pointed out, was that he gets a lot of pushback from colleagues in that he's out in the media, he's out making comments and interviews saying there really isn't a reason to increase the price once it hits the market. So that's where you get into the solution element of it.
And some are doing double-digit increases, et cetera. And what I learned from the piece that I didn't realize is there's trigger dates, timelines, that if they see their patents about to expire, before it goes to the generic market, that's when they'll hike the prices up again because that's their last cash grab if they can, right?
And that's where the lawsuits come into it. That's where the anti-competitive kind of discussion comes into this. It's the idea of, you know, where does business ethics, where does the short-sighted element of price hikes come into this? You know, when you're talking about a business model, you know, is it long-term to defend the patent more so than seeking new drugs? You know, that's the equation that you have to, the balance you have to strike. You know, is it better to try and reinvest your money in trying to find the next drug and knowing that your patent's going to expire, you're not going to fight it, and you're not going to try and grab as much money as you can before you lose that control and you start facing competition? You can redirect that to the science and to the innovation.
Obviously, we've been talking about this issue for years, but it came to a head for many where you had the poster child with Martin Shkreli, my words, that complete idiot here, who decided to hike prices up more than 500% for an AIDS drug. And when asked why, he said because he couldn't affect. That spoke to me, at least, about where is the regulation? Where is the advocate for the public right now in terms of saying, well, there are lines. I mean, you can't. You know, for example, we've seen recent disasters. People can't charge whatever they want at the pump just because they can command the dollar because people are in desperate straits. You can't have usury lending right now. We have regulations. Do those regulations exist for Big Pharma deciding where the caps are for what they can charge or not?
To some extent. I mean, your example there, the so-called Pharma Bro, he faced criminal charges and has been convicted. I mean, not on all 8, but I mean, there are charges that can be faced for any number of corruption, any number of fraud or stock speculation to a certain degree. I mean, these are publicly traded companies, a lot of these, and so you fall under the elements of market controls. But what you're getting at to the point of his defense, you know, him being the poster child of you know, the pure capitalistic greed model, I think, to some extent, really. And I think it's somewhat of a misdirection, I think, of the idea of where strong regulation comes into the discussion. And when you talk to some of the advocates, whether it's David Mitchell at Patients for Affordable Drugs or Kenneth Caton at the Tufts Center for the Study for Drug Development, they're talking about defining value-based models based on all the different factors that go into it.
Finally, remedy for this. You talked about some public pressures that are happening. There's some cases going through the courts. Legislatively, you mentioned some area lawmakers that are trying to create more transparency so they can see some of the math behind the decisions and the pricing. Should we have hope here that the solution will be through state legislatures, let alone Washington, or not?
I mean, I think in a lot of ways, a lot of the action is in motion already. I mean, there's some big breakthroughs in transparency. Whether it's, you know, the sidebar. The other element of this story is the databases that are out there that track industry money as how it goes to doctors, how it gets to doctors in influencing, you know, prescribing patterns, things of that nature. So I mean, there's already been some breakthroughs as far as transparency, and there's similar breakthroughs in drug pricing information that lawmakers have already won lawsuits to free up that information. And once the information's out there, and people who don't have a stake in it, you know, people who are hopefully coming at it from an independent perspective, start reviewing this information, they can start swaying that public discussion and start getting some of that legislative action. And some of the big elements also in the discussion are using the government's kind of size, its scope,
Yep.
its bargaining power at the table to influence it, whether through Medicare, Medicaid. There's existing roles that Medicaid and Medicare play at the negotiating table for prices, but there's a lot of advocates who would say they need to play a much more active and a much larger role in
And
that.
it's, of course, further complicated with the whole national debate on healthcare writ large. But it's a fascinating piece. It's already available online at loha.com, New York's Big Pharma Battlefield and Drug Price Wars, and you'll be able to see it in the pages of the Journal News this coming Sunday. David, I appreciate it.
Yes,
Great
Rich.
job. Thank
It
you
was a
very
pleasure.
much. You as well. And for more on this story, you can check out the Journal News piece, Pharma Battlefield. It's online now at loha.com, or you can catch it in print in the Journal News this Sunday. And coming up next, we'll take a look at some local headlines. So please stay with us.